So I've been waiting for this topic and for the topics that are coming the rest of this month. And as the time for the class has gotten closer, I have felt a little bit more like, oh my goodness, now I have this performance anxiety about how much what I want to share and how I want to share it. So I'm just going to take a moment now to hope that what I say will be the right thing and that you will receive what you need, and that if not, the conversation will continue and we'll just do our best. So the idea of the gift and the wound is something that has made a profound impact on my life that I first encountered when I was 21. And it was a tough time in my life. I was experiencing a lot of mental health challenges, a lot of anxiety, very severe depression, severe mental health challenges. And I went to a conference that's no longer happening, but it was called the Mythic Journeys Conference. And I don't even know how I found out about it, or how I got kind of connected. I'd never gone to a conference before. I was young, and everything seemed so big and new. So I went to Atlanta to go to this conference. And the first night that I was there, the first performance was a poetry reading by Coleman Barks, who is the prominent translator of Rumi's poetry into English, and Robert Bly. And they both were reading Rumi's poems, which I had never heard before, with this gorgeous live improvisational music accompanying them. And I just stood there and wept. Like, I felt like I was home in a home that I didn't even know that I had. And that was the beginning of my experience there. And there's a video actually of that performance on YouTube. I'll send it out to you guys so that you can, it's not the same as being in that room, but it's really cool that somebody captured that, and I can revisit it a little. So on maybe the second or the third day of the conference, I went to a session by a storyteller whose name is Michael Mead. And he does a lot of very interesting work with traditional stories and working with young people who, depending on what the term is that people use now, young people who are disadvantaged or at risk, or, whatever term might be used for kids who do not have a lot of privilege and opportunities, and are growing up in some amount of poverty, or in circumstances that are hard. And he told this story about three brothers, and the three brothers are setting out on this journey to look for beauty. And he starts out the tale, this was in the George W. Bush years, the Iraq War years. And he started the story by saying, once upon a time, very far away from here, but in a time of great political turmoil and corruption. And everyone laughed. And, now I look back on that and I think, oh, isn't that funny, that so often in human history, that's the setting, a time when the leaders seem corrupt in one way or another, as different as they might be. And as, there's a way that that's part of the human story. And I appreciate it, I think, now more than I did at the time. I took it as more of a specific commentary on the then sitting president. So then the story continues, and these three brothers go off, to set off on their journey to look for beauty. And the first brother is going along, and as the first thing he encounters after he goes through the woods is an old woman sitting at the crossroads. And she calls out to him and she says, "Oh, young man, I know you look very busy and purposeful, but won't you come and sit by me for a while and rub my sores and listen to your grandmother? And he says, I don't have time for you, old woman. Like, you're disgusting. Get out of here. And I'm on an important quest. And off he goes. And the story continues, and he meets an unfortunate fate and dies and does not make it to find beauty. Then the second brother, determined to do better than his older brother did, determined to learn from those mistakes and that he will not fall into such a foolish trap as that, he sets off on the journey to find beauty. And he too comes to the old woman at the crossroads. And the old woman calls out to him and says, young man, I know that you're very busy. You're moving in such a purposeful way, but I am old and tired, and I wonder if you would come and sit by me and rub my sores and listen to the stories of your grandmother. And the second brother is a little more polite. He says, I'm sorry, grandmother. I can see that you're suffering, and I can see that you have many stories to tell, but I really must be going. I'm on a very important quest for beauty. And she says, I understand, my son, I understand. And off he goes. And he too meets an unfortunate demise, a different one than his oldest brother, but he doesn't make it to find beauty either. And so, as often happens in these stories, the third, the youngest, sets off on the journey to look for beauty. And when he comes to the old woman at the crossroads and she calls out to him, instead of passing her by or deriding her or having a short, kind word and brushing her off, the third young man says, yes, grandmother, I'm not too busy for you. I will come and sit with you and rub your sores and listen to your stories. And so he does. And he comes over to her, and she's wearing these, rags that are very dirty, and it's not a pleasant experience to be sitting there with her. And she has a lot of lesions on her body that are hurting her. Her muscles ache. And the young man sits with her and tends to, her hands and her feet and her arms, her back. He combs his fingers through her hair and sort of arranges her hair nicely. And she tells him a series of stories and, things about her life and what she remembers. And after quite some time, the old woman says, son, I have a gift for you. This will be very helpful in the journey that you're on. I know that you are seeking beauty, but beauty is not as easy to find as many people think. And it doesn't live in the places where we expect it's going to live. And I want to give you this gift to help you on your quest, because I can see that you are pure of heart and you are just the sort of person who might be able to find beauty after all. And from the folds of her tattered clothes, she produces a beautiful white dove who immediately flies over and sits on the shoulder of the young man. And partly because I don't remember all of the details of the story after this piece, and then partly because this is the part that speaks to what we're working on today, I will just say that the story ends after many adventures in which the bird is able to give a signal or alert the young man to something that's coming that he otherwise wouldn't have seen, or very slightly but crucially influence events so that he is not killed as his other brothers were, and instead he does make it out to the land of the setting sun, and he does find beauty, and they are united together and joined in great happiness. So after he told the story, after Michael Meade told the story, this is what he said. He said, "So, I'm a storyteller and a teacher, but stories teach directly. I can't come here with a curriculum. I can come here with a story, and then you can tell me what stands out to you, what questions you have, what images really struck you, what the story makes you think of in your own life, and then on the basis of those things, I can teach." So he invited people to make observations and ask questions. And someone in the audience said, apparently for me as well as for themselves, because of all the things he taught that day, this is what I remember, and this has gone on to influence the next 12 or 13 years of my life in a profound way. So thank you to that person, whoever you were, who had this observation. Also a good reminder that when you ask a question, you ask it not just for yourself. You never know who you're helping by articulating a question to anybody that you want to learn from in a public forum. You might be articulating that question on behalf of someone who needs it even more than you do. It would shock me if this is like a foundational thing upon which I have built my life's work. It would shock me in a way if the person who originally asked the question got as much out of it as I did. It's so amazing to think of the ways that we all support each other without even knowing it. So this blessed person, who I owe so much, stood up and said, well, what really stands out to me in the story is, the young man sitting there and rubbing the old woman's sores. And based on that comment, Michael Meade said, yes, yes. That is an image of the gift and the wound, and of the world itself. The old woman in this story is a little bit like the world. It's old, it's tired, it's been here a long time, and there are places of sickness and pain within it. And this world is also our grandmother. It is the furthest back, generative source from which everything has come forth. And the wound is endless. She's absolutely covered in sores. Her clothes are a mess. Her whole body is decrepit. There is no sense in the story that rubbing the sores is going to make the sores go away, or is going to fix her or make her into a being that doesn't have sores or tattered clothes or a disheveled and dejected appearance. Because that is not the point. The wound is endless. And at the same time, it is from this same place where the wound lies that the gift of spirit, and the birds are often aligned with spirit in storytelling, that the gift comes forth that makes the journey possible. The gift that opens and unlocks every other moment of luck and of support, of learning, and that allows the young man to fulfill his ultimate destiny. That gift lives in the same place where the wound lives. And he went on to say, The gift and the wound are both endless. And so tending the wounds is a devotional process, like prayer. And the gift is endless too. The gift, as you heal a little bit of the wound, or you tend the wound, you pay attention to the wound, it frees up a little more of the gift. And as we use more of the gift, it opens up and touches off a little bit more of the sacred wound. And in this kind of spiraling dance, we do deeper healing and tending of the wounded parts of ourselves and of our community and our world. And more gift, more capacity, more of our talents, more goodness, more of our very spirits come alive and become available, because the gift does not exist in isolation. We don't get to be strong or beautiful or talented or productive or any of these things, or have abundance in any form. We don't get to have these things and then just keep them for ourselves and hoard them. That's not healthy. It's not functional. It doesn't work. What happens, this is so hard to learn, you guys. I have to remind myself and my clients of this many times. What really tends to happen is we get a little more strength. We get a little more margin. A little bit more of our talent kind of opens up and reveals itself to us. Or like, something good happens in life, like for me, I move into this house that I'm so thrilled to be here. Good things come, you get a little bit more strength, more margin, more gifts. And just a moment after you have that increased gift, that increased capacity, something will come into that space that needs your attention for healing. And it might be your own stuff that has just been patiently waiting for the time to come forward and say, hey, now it's my turn, take care of me. Or it might be that someone that you're connected to, and we're connected to everyone, right? Someone that you're connected to needs that space, that margin, that resource, that capacity that you have developed, and you will be called to share it in some way. Okay, so Kayla says, OMG, it connects to everything, it seems. I am almost speechless. Yeah, that's how I felt. That's how I felt upon hearing this for the first time. That's how I felt. So of course, for those of you who know my story, I did say that I would share a little bit of my own story here. So for those of you who know my story, this is true for so many people who go into any kind of healing work, like to the point that it's a joke, like people who are like psychotherapists often have the reputation for like having had a lot of sort of neuroticism themselves. It's like what makes it possible to empathize and have the interest in the field. People who go into complementary medicine very often, as was the case with me, either have a bad experience with conventional medicine. The options that were available were not really good, and that's a very tough experience to go through, and it can sometimes push people into this field. In my case, I've had many different illnesses at different points in my life, and finally had to go through the experience of needing healthcare and not being able to get it, before I finally said, I've always wanted to study herbal medicine. It seems like a crazy thing to do, but you know what? This is crazier. Like, it's crazier to live in a world where we don't know how to use the plants that are all around us for our own health. And I'm not going to stand for it anymore. I'm gonna use this experience as a chance to move forward and learn this thing I've always wanted to learn. So And then, you know, in my continued journey with my own healing, I've had to keep coming up against the edge of my own willingness to love myself, to take care of myself, to do the hard things that we have to do to change our behavior. And every time that I do that, I learn something about what works and what doesn't in certain contexts. And then those things that I learn that come out of the really not pleasant experience of tending my own wounds, the knowledge that comes out of it is like the bird, you know, that helps and provides guidance. There are other gifts that come out of things like this that are maybe a little bit more intangible. Having gone through certain difficult experiences that I know some of you have gone through who are here with me, things you yourself have gone through, things that loved ones have gone through. Having been through something, there can be a quality of fearlessness or gravitas, knowledge, solidity that comes into you when you know what you're capable of withstanding if you have to. And it can make it possible to stand not only for yourself in the future, but it can make it possible to stand for others who are in similar situations. And at that moment, they might not know that they can make it. They might not know that they can get through to the other side. That was the primary gift that came from the really difficult experiences that I had last year. I had a moment, I think in early January, where I had a string of people come to me, one after another, some of whom I had not worked with before and some of whom I had. And it was like I knew inside when they described the situation that they were in, and I was like, yep, that's hell. That's a flavor of hell. That is hell where you are right now. And I know that that's hell, or that's part of the underworld, because I was just there. I was just there. And I know the geography, and I know the map, and I know what the signposts are that you're on your way in, and what the signposts are that you're on your way out. And because I have been there, because I'm on my way back from there, I know that it's not going to swallow you up and eat you. I know that you can come through on the other side. And having had that experience gave me a sense of not being afraid, where it would be quite natural to be afraid. Okay. Kayla says, I especially like the part that we have to be careful not to hoard the gifts that come. Yeah. It's a balance, right? Because there is a way that we can actually deplete ourselves by being so focused on others that we don't allow ourselves to do any restoring or healing or to partake of any of our own gifts or the fruits of any of our own experiences and labor. So the push that's so big right now, I read an article earlier this week about like millennials and self-care, and how millennials are so focused on self-care more than any other generation. And it's like one of the many things that other generations are looking at the millennials and going like, what are you guys doing? You know? And I have to admit that sometimes I look around and, at certain spaces online or certain things, and I think like, guys, like you're taking a lot of care of yourself, but like, who else are you taking care of? Like, I see this sometimes. And then, so that can be a phenomenon, that can be a danger. And at the same time, there are people who genuinely need the message of like, you cannot just keep taking care of everyone else to the exclusion of yourself. It has to be a circle that includes, this is what is so important about the gift and the wound, is that you can't have one without the other. You have to have both sides, both of these opposites together at all times. So it's not about saying, sometimes there's that temptation to take the wound and like turn it into something good, you know? Someone passes away and the quick thing that gets said is, well, it's such a good thing because she's not suffering anymore, you know? It's such a blessing. And that's trying to turn the wound into just a gift and make the wound go away. And that doesn't work. And then at the same time, if we're talking about self-care and self-love and healing and herbs and yoga and all this good stuff, but we're so focused on like, think positive, attract good things to yourself, like manifest abundance, and like no one can acknowledge anything painful in their personal lives, in their families, in their communities, let alone in the world. Sometimes I think focusing a lot on the wounds of the world is a way of actually avoiding working on the wounds that we are more personally responsible for, but that's another story for another day. We have to have both. So yeah, thanks, Kayla. Understanding this makes me feel more comfortable with the constant tending of my own wounds because it really does seem endless, but understanding how these wounds and gifts interact is so helpful. Yeah. Oh, yeah, this is the other thing. Kayla, thank you. You're helping me so much right now teach this class. Like that was the other huge relief of hearing this for me for the first time. I was in a pretty darn wounded period of my life. Like the wounds were just running the show at that point. And it did feel endless. And I had a long way to go before I could really be before I could dig myself out of the hole in a sense. But somehow hearing this story that was so old and this message was so clearly baked in, we're going to see in another story in a moment, like this is a motif that recurs that now you can look for out in, when you're watching shows or when you're going to the theater, or you're hearing stories. Now you can listen for this. You're going to start to notice it showing up. There's a way that it was so comforting because I thought that the endlessness I was feeling about my wounds was particular to me. I thought that I was the problem, that I was the unusually broken one, and that it was just me and everyone else was pretty much fine, and that they were fine in ways that I could never be fine. And it was a way that I was making myself different, and that I was feeling worse about the things that I was struggling with because it felt like I was bad and wrong and unusual for having those problems in the first place. And what the story teaches us and what this motif teaches us is that while everybody's journey in life is different, if you're pursuing a deep ideal, a deep spiritual principle in your life, such as beauty, if you're pursuing something like this, you have to encounter endless wounding on the path and you have to tend to it. And it doesn't make you bad or wrong. It makes you someone who is walking the path of being human. Okay. All right. Anything else? Any other thoughts or questions or observations that you guys would like to share? Okay. So I promised that we would talk a little bit about Western herbalism today because we missed the Western herbalism class because I was moving. And I realized that there's a way of integrating my biggest takeaway from Western herbalism as a whole with this idea of the gift and the wound. So the Western herbal tradition is very frustrating to me. And the reason for this is because, unlike the tradition from China and the tradition from India, and I believe this would be true about traditional Thai medicine as well, and probably many other systems that have not been disrupted by settling or, colonialism, this sort of thing. Traditions that are very old and intact. The Western herbal tradition was disrupted. For many, 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 many centuries, the place where healing knowledge resided in the Western world was within monasteries and convents. It was associated with this sort of healing function, and the growing of the herbs and knowing what to do with them was something that lived with the religious people. And this is actually not so different from things that we see in Asia now. The temples in Thailand where you receive healing, monasteries in China where certain hereditary traditions of medicine are passed down. This is a very this sort of connection between the spiritual healing and the physical healing has shown up in many places around the world. It was true in the West as well. And the Western tradition, kind of started with ancient Greece and in the Middle East as well, the influence of Avicenna and through ancient Greece and passing down all the way, and comes to the monasteries as sort of hanging out through the Middle Ages, and we get to a point where the tradition is interrupted. And there are a number of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that there is a birth of the scientific method and the scientific tradition, which wants to disassociate itself from the superstitions of the past and the idea that astrology is connected, the time of the year and the moon and the sun has anything to do with the herbs and the powers that they have or any of this sort of thing. And that the idea that, these sort of folk practices are now to be distrusted. And there's a lot of talk about, the Inquisition, and these were traditions that were really held by women, and there's a kind of misogyny that came in and forced that away. And I believe that played a role, but I also have the sense that an even bigger role was just the complete revolution in thinking that happened with the Enlightenment and the dawn of scientific thinking. And as medicine moved in this direction of the scientific tradition, and all of those previous methods of energetic assessment and connecting the microcosm of the human body with the macrocosm of nature and understanding how to intervene in a way that's much more similar to these Eastern forms of medicine, that was lost. It wasn't that the two traditions didn't continue side by side, where in these other cultures where the scientific tradition didn't take root so in such a way quite so early, the pre-scientific worldview continued, and those traditions continued to be developed and preserved. In the West, it was quite the opposite. So now what we have are a bunch of herbs, which we know do stuff, and no consistent system or way of matching those herbs with the humans that need them, or with formulating in a way that is truly reflective of holism. And so this is the wound. This is the big wound at the heart of Western herbal practice. This absence, this lack of a coherent way of seeing the world outside of a mechanistic scientific tradition. Now, remember, the gift and the wound are always together. The benefit to human health and well-being that the scientific tradition has wrought is absolutely unparalleled in human history. I wouldn't be alive. Out of my entire family, maybe only my father would be alive today if it weren't for the scientific tradition, because my mom would have died from a condition that wouldn't have been treatable without modern medicine, and my sister and I would never have been born, and that would have been it, And that's true for so many of us, so many of our families. So there's an incredible gift here, but what we lost was huge in terms of the herbal tradition. And out of that wound have sprung more gifts. And what they have to do with are practices and ways of trying to rebuild our connection with our intuition and with the plants. So while I am certain that there are practices within other traditions that have to do with sitting with a plant and breathing with the plant and noticing the impressions that you have as you sit with the plant, or making a flower essence of the flower, and which, if you don't know about flower essences, there's no plant matter in them. It is basically like water molecules that maybe at some point touched other water molecules that at some point touched the flower is basically what's in there, preserved in alcohol. And then seeing what energetic or psychic almost impressions come up as you work with that, non-physical essence of the flower of a plant. And because of the work that I do, because of the kinds of suffering that people come to me with, most of the time, I don't find these methods sufficient for addressing the problems that my clients are facing, because it is very important to me, not just that we wake up our intuitions, it's very important to me that people get better. And I am frustrated with the Western herbal tradition because I would love nothing more than to be able, I wish I could be a traditional Irish herbalist, because that is where my roots are from, or even traditional Polish herbalist, my great-grandmother was from Poland. I wish I could do it like that. But there isn't an intact tradition there that's strong enough to help me solve the kinds of problems that I'm tasked with helping to solve. But here's what there is. There is a method and a longing that this gap in the Western herbal tradition has brought forward that has started to draw people in to having more experiences with plants, to growing their own herbs. More and more, I now have clients who say things to me like, yeah, but would it be possible for me to grow could I grow any of these plants? Or is this something that I could have as a tea, even just 4 years ago when I first started working in this way, it was like everybody would just say to me, how do I not taste the herbs? Like, how do I have like this little awareness of how bad they taste as possible? So it seems like there is something waking up here. There's a longing that's coming in. So that's my basic feeling about Western herbalism. It's a source of great frustration and loss, and then also some really useful spiritual practices and ways of thinking about the plants as beings. But it's not terribly useful for my day-to-day work. But it's very useful in as I just live and walk in the world and exist. Okay. If you guys have questions, please just ask them. Otherwise, we're going to carry on with one more angle on the idea of the gift and the wound. Sorry, I'm hearing something. So the other piece I want to mention here is that there are gifts that come in that can be related directly to trauma. So rather than thinking about just, the endless nature of wounding of, the world and of our human hearts, our human community, there are times when extraordinary capacity comes forward in a person directly related to trauma. So you can think about the emergency of a child being trapped under a car and a mother being able to lift the car, like with the superhuman strength almost, and like break multiple bones, and she's able to do it, because of the extremity of the situation. That can happen. That can happen in many different forms. So sometimes the very things that are your talents and your gifts, the things that people would say, she's so gifted at that. Sometimes those things have origin stories that are rooted in a trauma. And again, the important thing here is neither to reduce the experience to trauma itself, kind of writing off the gifts, nor to skip over the fact that as beautiful as the gifts are, the trauma still happened. So I wanted to make that point. Okay, Parsifal. Now we're going to talk about Parsifal, and then unless there are more questions, then we'll be done with this for today. So it's not fashionable anymore, it's like not fashionable right now to talk about like the Knights of the Round Table and chivalry and these sort of things. So forgive the lack of fashionableness here. But I think this is a really good gift and wound story. The story of the Fisher King is the idea that, or it sort of begins with the idea that there is somewhere in a barren land, there is a king whose kingdom has fallen into sort of just despair. The crops are not growing. The people are uneasy and feel defeated. There's a sense of everything feels like dried up. There's no more possibility. Things are defeated. It's hard to even keep going. The king himself has pretty much given up too, and he, instead of tending to his kingly duties, he goes out and daydreams and casts his fishing line into the river and sits there day after day and doesn't catch anything. And the king is often depicted in stories as having a wound in his thigh, in his groin. There's a wound that is connected to his own sort of generative power has been attacked. This kingdom and this king would be seen as being both yin and yang deficient in the Chinese system. And meanwhile, somewhere within the castle where this king lives is the Holy Grail, which in legend this is said to be the cup that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper when he shared bread and wine. That this was the chalice or the cup, the grail that he drank from at that particular meal, at that moment. And by virtue of its place in spiritual history, that the grail has healing powers, has very significant healing powers. And so the Knights of the Round Table, their whole thing is about like going on quests that in some way make the world a better place. You know, that's the idea. They're setting out to do noble things and to go on worthy quests, and in doing this and adhering to this code of honor and responsibility and pursuing worthy missions, they're going to make the world a better place. So this is very unfashionable to talk about, but I feel like, I mean, can't you all sort of recognize yourselves in that in some way? Like, doesn't it feel like that's what many of us are hoping to do, is like be engaged in a worthy pursuit to make that one bit of difference and hopefully do it honorably, and maybe do it with a group of fellows, by which I mean fellow humans, not necessarily fellas like guys, but with a group of fellows who are also engaged in their own aligned pursuits, and we can sort of support each other and this sort of thing. And each of the, you know, like any good story, each of these knights, they all have their own personalities and their own like backstory and their own quirks. And so this particular knight that we're talking about, Parsifal, he has this kind of interesting backstory where, you know, he's like pretty pure-hearted, and his father died, and so he's like seeking a quest. You know, he's kind of this, you know, fatherless son, and he's been like living out in the forest with his mother. He hasn't really been part of society, and he comes into King Arthur's court, and there's like a young girl who sees him and has a prophecy. It says, I see great things for you, or something of that nature. And after he has this kind of initial introduction, on his way back to the forest, on the way back to his home, he comes across the castle where the Fisher King lives. And he's invited inside. And in fact, he's invited for dinner with the Fisher King himself. And I picture it kind of like that first dinner in Beauty and the Beast, where like she sits down and like the beast is at the other end of a really long table, and then all of these weird things start happening around, you know, like the candlestick dances or whatever, you know, and I picture it kind of like that. So Parsifal sits down, and, you know, he's not that social. He's been living in the woods with his mom. He doesn't know the procedure for a dinner with a king and all this stuff. He's kind of overwhelmed and clueless. He's sitting across from the Fisher King, and the first thing that he sees, you know, they're eating some dinner, and he's like doing okay. And then he sees a lance, like like the long weapon that if you were jousting, you would be riding the horse with. This lance, not attached to anybody, just floats through space, like right in front of him, like right across the table. And the lance is actually bloody. It's bleeding actively. But the Fisher King doesn't acknowledge it. And, none of the servants who are waiting, nobody acknowledges it. So Parsifal he does kind of the thing that a lot of us would do in a social situation where you're a little bit out of your depth and nobody else is acknowledging. You just sort of like, okay, I guess this is normal. I'm not going to say anything. All right, that was pretty weird, but I'm going to keep my cool and keep it together. So then, after that, then another weird thing happens. I think it actually does have to do with the candelabra. So now I'm thinking of Lumiere, some candelabras float through the air, or people carrying float through the air. Again, something very strange, but this time having to do with light and illumination. Again, nobody reacts. Again, Parsifal keeps his mouth shut. And then lastly, a very beautiful young girl passes before him, carrying a chalice that is intricately adorned. And something in Parsifal kind of goes, that's the Grail. But again, he doesn't say anything. The dinner concludes. He says thank you to the king. Off he goes. And he finds, when he returns home, he finds that his mother has died. He doesn't know what to do. He goes back to King Arthur's court and tells the other knights the story of what's happened to him. And there is a lady there. We can imagine her actually as being the same lady who was in the story that we started with today, the lady at the crossroads, the truth teller, the prophet, the seer, the wise woman. And this lady says to him, you really messed up. You were meant to ask. You were meant to ask the king what was wrong with his leg. You were meant to ask, what ails you, king? You were meant to ask, what is this bleeding lance? What are these candlesticks? And you were meant to ask, what is the Grail and who does it serve? And I love this story. Because it has everything to do with acknowledging the things that everyone around us would conspire to leave unacknowledged. And that the only way that we can heal, the only way we can reach the things that we most desire, the only way that the purity of our intentions and the goodness that is within us to do can come out into the world. Parsifal was meant to be the one who could bring the Grail into consciousness, essentially, where it could be used and known, and where it could restore the health of the kingdom, of the king, and of possibly the whole world. He was in the right place at the right time. And like so many of us do, he was afraid to ask the question that was right on the tip of his tongue. Because you can't see a bleeding lance float over the dinner table and not want to ask somebody, what in the world is going on here? Why? What is this? But I will tell you, sometimes it's really not easy to ask those obvious questions. Sometimes it's really not easy to feel the truth in the room. Feel the truth between yourself and another person, and to say it out loud. But that is the bridge that makes the generative transformation between gift and wound possible. It is our willingness to ask the question. The question might not be, what ails you, though that's often a really good one. Sometimes people don't know. Sometimes you can't answer it for yourself, but what's wrong? What ails you is a very good question. It's often a very good question to ask, what is this thing that I see before me? What is this that's happening? Just to name it, just to acknowledge it. So with that, I hope to send you forth into your week emboldened a little bit, knowing that your gifts are endless and the wound is endless. Some part of it is yours, and some part of it is connected to you just by virtue of the fact that we're all human, we're here together. And you can always ask, where is the gift here in this situation if you're mostly seeing the wound? And you can always ask, where is the wound if you're mostly seeing the gift? I can stay on for another minute or two if any of you have questions or thoughts that you want to share before we close. Okay. I know a couple of you wanted to be here tonight and couldn't, Helen and Susan. So I'm thinking of all of you. And I'm also realizing by the number of people who ask me if there are recordings that I don't know if all of you guys know there are recordings. So I'm going to send that out to everybody as well. And I hope that this finds you at a time when you need it. And I hope that you'll come back to this video or to these ideas when you need them most. I'm sure it isn't going to be as helpful for everyone as it has been for me, but having made the impact on my life that this idea has, I absolutely feel that there's nothing better for me to do than share it as often as I feel moved to share it. So with that, my darlings, thank you so much, Kayla. With that, I'm going to say goodnight, and I hope that you have a beautiful rest of your week, and we will be back next week. I can't remember if it's Tuesday or Wednesday, but it will be one of those nights next week, and we're going to continue on with, it's basically Wounded Healer Month this month. We're going to talk about more nuances of this over the course of the rest of the month. All right. Take care, my darlings. I love you. See you guys soon.